Okay.
So, IDE family, this is our penultimate episode, the last deep dive of season 1. Join us on Friday for our season finale, which will be on the yard. We're ending our season by talking about the beginning. After the French Revolution, over 500,000 enslaved Black people demanded abolition of slavery on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which was a harsh and brutal plantation regime. France refused, and Toussaint Louverture was like, "Are you sure you want to do this? We outnumber you 10-1, and there's dissension among your ranks due to the French Revolution. Like, are you really, really sure?" So Louverture led a successful armed uprising against this major colonial power, and the beatdown resounded globally. On January 1st, 1804, independence was declared, and the modern nation of Haiti was created. And the word Haiti in French is actually Haiti, which is actually the original name the indigenous Taino people gave to the island prior to the invasion of Columbus. So it was returned to its pre-colonial name. For our last deep dive of the season, we're going to chat about Haitian independence, the global significance of that independence, and how our folks celebrate on January 1st. What are they doing? What are they eating? I'm really excited to do this with Dr. Régine Jean-Charles. Régine Michelle Jean-Charles is a Black feminist literary scholar and cultural critic specializing in Francophone studies. She's an associate professor of French and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. Her scholarship and teaching on world literatures in French includes Black France, Sub-Saharan Africa, Haiti, and the Haitian diaspora. She is the author of Conflict Bodies, The Politics of Rape Representation in the Francophone Imaginary. She's currently working on 2 book projects, one on Black feminist ethics in contemporary Haitian fiction, and another on Haitian girlhood in literary and visual text. Hi, Régine. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
And it's so funny because originally when we first connected, it was about something else. And then here we are talking about this. And it's really serendipitous because of the time, which we'll get into later. But so I gave a brief overview of the Haitian Revolution, which lasted from 1791 to 1804. What is it about the Haitian Revolution that is so significant?
Thank you so much for that question. I love it so much. And I'm so happy that you said it lasted from 1791 to 1804, because that's one of the first things that I always tell my students or when I'm giving a lecture, because, I grew up in a Haitian household where we were very proud of our heritage. And my parents would always tell me stories about the Haitian Revolution, but they never told me about this kind of long process of revolution, right? So I just thought that, the enslaved Africans were just one day, they were like, we've had enough of this. And then they just got up and they took their freedom. But in fact, it was a very long process, right? That began in 1791 with this actually a ceremony at Bois Caïman. It was a Vodou ceremony, and it was led, one of the people that was in that ceremony was Boukman, who was a formerly enslaved African who had kind of run off. The Maroons were people that escaped the plantation and lived in hiding in the forests, right? So Haiti, which means mountainous land, has a very dense, at the time had beautiful forests and this kind of very dense environment that allowed for the Maroons to have this. And so one of the things that they weren't allowed to do under the Code Noir, the Black Code, which was the laws that regulated the colony, they were not allowed to gather. They were not allowed to have religious ceremonies. They could only practice Catholicism. But in this, so already by being gathered for this ceremony, they were defying the Code Noir, and they were doing so by having a Vodou ceremony. And it was a mix of enslaved people. Some of them were Maroons. Some of them were people that still were working on the plantations where they worked. There had been a spate of poisonings across the colonies prior to the Haitian Revolution also. So again, this is just to say leading up to the process, right? What is that process of revolution? So at this ceremony, there was a woman by the name of Cécile Fatima, who was a Mambo, who was present. It was basically prophesied that the Haitians would have this revolution, and that they would break their chains and that they would become free. And so for many people, locate that as kind of the original kind of symbolic moment that signaled the beginning of the Haitian Revolution. And I think what makes the Haitian Revolution, it's so important. A Martinican author that I love named Aimé Césaire calls Haiti is the place where Blackness, where negritude stood up for the first time. And what he means by this is that this was the first time that people took a stance against anti-Blackness in a really important way, right? And so it's not to say, again, obviously we know, coming from the African continent, that we were asserting ourselves, our culture, our heritage, our music, everything for centuries prior to this. But this was the first stance against anti-Blackness, right? In this huge, huge way. And so I think that that's an important way to think about Haiti, is that it was not just about, ending slavery, but it was about, a move. It was a human rights project, right? It was an assertion of the humanity. It was an extension of how we understand freedom. Because if you think about the way that the American Revolution, the US, the revolution is talked about, or even the French Revolution, where they talk about liberty, equality, fraternity, none of those things really could exist in either of those countries, because they were still enslaving people. Right. Whereas in Haiti, we were able to take it to truly realize a kind of freedom that went for the complete abolition of slavery, for the true freedom of all people, for the true amplification and assertion of humanity.
And when you talked about that first ceremony, I actually got chills. When you talked about the ceremony that was essentially the launch pad for how that intersection of really just pushing back against all the things that they were not supposed to do, intersecting together with something that essentially became the first Black Republic. And, it's funny because I didn't realize, because I'm Jamaican, and we always talked about Maroons like, having a Maroon in your family is a source of pride in Jamaica. Exactly. Yeah. And when I was researching for this episode, I didn't realize that word was kind of used throughout the Caribbean. I thought that was also really interesting too.
Isn't that awesome though about the Caribbean? Like how we have all of these like reverberations across. Yeah.
I love it so much. And everything that I've read, the idea that this could happen was so, even without me reading it, I knew that it was just sort of incomprehensible to the European colonialist imagination, right? That this could happen. And to your point about pushing back against anti-Blackness and why that was so important, it's so funny because just the way that my mind works, like, these things happened in the 1700s and the 1800s. And obviously in my 2020 imagination, I can't actually imagine like what these people were thinking. So I was reading this really interesting article that was published in 2015 in Slate magazine by Edward Baptiste. And then he says in 1800, because now keeping in mind, the French Revolution ended in 1804. So in 1800, Saint-Domingue was still a part of the French Republic, but it was at this point basically independent. And Toussaint Louverture would send letters to Paris to Napoleon, styling himself as the first of the Blacks. Right. Yes. And so I thought that was really interesting because I was like, I know Napoleon, that was making him like big mad. He was already mad. He was already mad, but I know he was like this. And so what's really interesting is in the article, they go on to say, Napoleon sent the largest invasion fleet that ever crossed the Atlantic, some 50,000 men to the island of Saint-Domingue under the leadership of his brother-in-law. He didn't just send anybody, he sent his brother-in-law.
That's right.
And then Napoleon commanded, subdue any resistance by deception and force, return slavery to all the Africans who survived, no more gilded Africans. The article was really, really long, but that piece right there, no more gilded Africans, really resonated with me because it made me feel as if it wasn't about Napoleon just losing, the Caribbean is small.
Right.
These islands are small, right?
Right.
It wasn't just about that. In his mind, he said, how dare you think that you are going to be anything more than this permanent lower class? We cannot allow you to feel like, you're our equal.
Correct. Yes. That was really the affront to them, right? So yes, Haiti was the most prosperous at the time, most prosperous colony. Again, like I said, that beautiful natural environment that I was describing. They, had the sugar plantations and at the time, this was kind of like the height of sugar. Everybody wanted sugar. Europeans had become obsessed with sugar, right? So it was an extremely prosperous colony. And, there was this audacity of the Haitians, right? Particularly Toussaint Louverture, who wrote very well. You can, again, archives, and there are lots of, history books that have been written about the correspondence between Toussaint Louverture and Napoleon and others during this time. And he also kind of theorized freedom, right? Like the same way that you had with the French Revolution, right? That happened in 1789, the same way that we had all of this writing that came out of it, and people were theorizing what freedom meant, and they were philosophizing. They were philosophizing about, what does freedom mean? What does it look like? That's what he was doing. And the audacity of that was something that, Napoleon could not wrap his mind around. And
he's like, I won't stand for this. I won't stand for this. Yep. I'm sending my brother-in-law over.
And in fact, it's interesting because, Toussaint Louverture was eventually captured and sent to France. Well, not captured. He was tricked into going to France, and he, told that he would meet with Napoleon and, whatnot. And as soon as he got there, he was put in prison, and he ended up dying in a prison in Fort du Joux. He continues to write letters during that time. And one of the last letters that he wrote, he said, in capturing me, you have, oh gosh, how does it go again? In capturing me, you have cut off a branch of the tree of liberty, but its roots are deep and it will continue, right? So I got the exact quote wrong, but the point being this: maybe you've cut off the trunk of the tree, actually might be what it is, because he wasn't that humble that he would call himself a branch. So,
right, clearly. Clearly.
You cut off the tree, but the roots of the tree are deep. And sure enough, the Haitian Revolution. So basically he was saying, like, yes, you got me, but guess what? My people are going to continue this fight, and it's not over. And he was correct about that.
Yes, ma'am. There was a very interesting, when thinking about how the Haitian Revolution impacted other, the other aspects of the Americas. There was an interesting paper published on the University of Kentucky's website entitled The Haitian Revolution, A Different Route to Emancipation by Professor Jeremy Popkin. And one of the things I just want to sort of, I like to establish a baseline a lot of times. So apparently the French slave colonies had a very different social structure from slave states of the American South. Mm-hmm. So in the United States, non-whites were almost always put in the same class as Black slaves. But in the French colonies, many whites had emancipated their mixed race children, mm-hmm. creating a class of free coloreds. Mm-hmm. And then the free coloreds were often well-educated and prosperous. And then this group owned about a third of the slaves in the colony. Then this class of coloreds also made up most of the island's militia, which was responsible for keeping the enslaved Black people under control. So in Haiti, you had white colonists, you had free coloreds, you had free Blacks that were maroons, then you had indigenous people, and then you had enslaved Blacks.
Correct.
So according to this article, enslaved Black people outnumbered whites in mm-hmm. Saint-Domingue by more than 10-1. Mm-hmm. And then the French Revolution caused ascension among whites. Then the mixed race population also, I guess, apparently got mad at them about the French Revolution. So then mm-hmm. they got turned against them. Mm-hmm. And then also Toussaint's success also depended heavily on his ability to play different colonial powers against each other. They said that he benefited from support from the Spanish, the British, and the Americans. Mm-hmm. Then it also says, what I thought was super interesting, that understanding what made the Haitian Revolution successful makes us understand why white slave owners in the American South were able to keep power for so long.
Oh.
And I found that to be really, really interesting, because it was kind of like this perfect storm, so to speak, that was happening in Haiti that, didn't exist in the American South. So I thought that was super interesting. And another thing that I found to be really interesting when I was, preparing for this conversation is with respect to how Haiti impacted France. We know, they were pissy, but also it ended Napoleon's efforts to build the French Empire in the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And many argued that it caused France to decide to sell its North American holdings in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really interesting as well.
Like, so it also shapes the United States. Yeah.
I don't think that's a part of American history.
No, it's not. It's not. There's actually a great article, I think it's in The Atlantic very recently, about why Haitian history should be taught in high schools, that I would encourage you to also look at. And this is true because it really helps to shape your understanding. I mean, you could do world history, Caribbean history, you could do the history of the Americas, right? And they're just reverberations that the Haitian Revolution had all over. I mean, they influenced in Latin America. There were, revolutions that were influenced by the Haitian Revolution as well. And so it's a really rich point of departure for teaching world history, right? In a very robust way, I think. And Jeremy Popkin is actually a well-known historian who works on Haiti. And I'm not familiar with the article that you were talking about, but I know that he has this book called, I think it's You All Are Free, it's called. And so, yeah, he's done a lot of work. In fact, it's a very exciting time. I'm not a historian, I'm a literature scholar. But we all, are interdisciplinary in the work that we do. But I will say that for the Haitian historians and literary historians in particular, it's been a very exciting, like the past maybe like 10 years. There've been a lot of just great books that are coming out about, books about Henri Christophe, about Dessalines, about the Haitian Revolution from different, perspectives, new archives people are talking about. And it's just a very exciting time, I think, in the scholarship. And there's so much for people to discover, which is why, my hope is always that it's so exciting to me to hear you say like, and I was doing research and I heard this because I'm like, yes, because so many people don't look at Haiti, beyond the headlines, right? Or beyond any of the stereotypes. So it's really exciting to me to see you amplifying it in this way.
And I'm curious, there's something that you brought up and it came up in one of our previous episodes. So we did a whole 4-episode series, 2 deep dives, 2 on the art. We explored anti-Blackness and Latinidad. And we spoke with a Puerto Rican student who attends Morehouse and a Cuban student who attends FAMU. And one of the things, and it's so interesting because I feel like I always like really prepare really well for these conversations. And then someone says something that completely catches me off guard, right? And so he said, yeah, because, when people think of Latinos or the Latinx community, they think of mestiza, they think like Jennifer Lopez. They don't think of people who look like me because, this young man, he looked like you or me, right? And so, and he said, like they don't think about Haitians. And I was like, wait a minute. That's right. That was Dominican Republic and Haiti is all one piece of land. So it's like, if that's Latin America too. I'm like, Haitians, I was like, so we're like having this conversation. I'm like, wait a minute, hold up. Right. Haitians are Latinx. Do you consider yourself to be Latina?
I do not. Okay. And it's interesting because this has been like, this is one of those like hot topics in the Haitian community.
Really?
Right here. Oh my gosh. Yes, because it started, a few years ago, people were like, well, Haitians should consider themselves to be Latinx. And so I think that for me, I have so much, and despite like what I understand to be true about Afro-Latinidad, I just have so much pride in thinking about us as the first Black nation, Black, like I was always raised Black, Blackity, Black, right? Okay. And so that part, right? So for me, now intellectually, like as a scholar, I can look at it and I can understand why, for example, sometimes, there's some organizations like what is it called? LASA, Latin American Studies Association, where they've incorporated Haiti more, right? And so it certainly makes sense if you're thinking about it from like a geographic standpoint, if you're thinking about it from a historical standpoint, even if you think about the fact that like so many, with foreign occupations and so many of the ways that the Big Brother United States has invaded, right, in the US and other parts of Latin America. Well, I guess there's also Grenada, though, and other parts of the Anglophone Caribbean. But there are ways in which we feel more similar to our Caribbean brothers and sisters who are Hispanophone than our Caribbean brothers and sisters who are Anglophone, right? So like, for example, we don't use curry. I mean, this is a very basic, right, like
Right.
food thing. And so I understand, but for me personally, it's just, I don't know. I'm just said, despite everything I know to be true about Afro-Latinidad, and I do think
Right.
people do a disservice to the Latinx community by like denying them Blackness, right? But despite that, I don't know, it just, for me, it doesn't work. And I'm always like,
Yeah, I get it. I get it. So, how do you see the Haitian Revolution? Did you see historically, was there an impact on other colonized peoples?
The Haitians also were, they occupied the Dominican Republic. They liberated the Dominican Republic from the Spanish, so that when the Dominicans got their independence later on, they got their independence from the Haitians, which some people argue is why there's some contention. And I think I'm really appreciative of scholars like Dixa Ramirez and Lorja Garcia Peña, who have done some brilliant work recently that's like helping us to undo some of that mythology around the relationship between Haitians and Dominicans. Which for a long time was seen in a very rigid way. But I think that that's another example, of other people.
Okay. Haiti has been mired by poverty since it declared its independence. Can you explain the significance of establishing an independent nation without depending on enslaved people?
So I wouldn't say that I think that's true, especially when you know the story of King Christophe, Henry Christophe, who had this very lavish court and kingdom, and he was ruling in Cap-Haïtien in the north. And it's, again, there's been a lot of really wonderful scholarship about this in recent years. Someone in particular I would encourage you to or your listeners to look at is a woman by the name of Marlena Daut, D-A-U-T, who's written a lot. And she actually even has a digital project about King Christophe's court, which really shows us, from the fashion to the balls and the architecture. This was the time that the Citadel was built in Haiti. The Citadel was this enormous fortress that was built in order to ensure that if the French tried to come back, they would be able to attack them from this Citadel. It was also the time that Sans Souci Palace and the cathedral in Cap-Haïtien were built. So there was a time of very there was certainly a time of productivity and gain, right? That was not, we couldn't identify with poverty. But I don't know. I think what's hard about that question for me is that the fact of the matter is that there was an indemnity that was levied against Haiti, right, as a result of the revolution. And then there were so many countries that didn't recognize Haiti's sovereignty. And so I really look at the decline in relation to how Haiti was punished by other countries in the world, right? And again, we know that it's because of anti-Blackness. I see it more as a result of that. As opposed to a decision to have or not have enslaved people. And they certainly, this is part of how Dessalines died. So I should say, so Toussaint Louverture, who we talked about, he ended up dying in France. And the person that continued was the general of the Haitian Revolution, was Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And Jean-Jacques Dessalines led the successful, so he was the head of the army that was eventually successful, right, in overthrowing slavery. And he was the first, he called himself Emperor Dessalines. So he was the first leader, right, of Haiti. And, but this is something that Dessalines thought about. And Dessalines was like, we need to figure out how we're going to work these lands. And so he wanted to bring people back into a system of working the land. And he was overthrown and actually killed because of that, right? Because people were like, absolutely not. Like, this is part of our constitution, right? That everyone is free on this land. And so he tried to come up with a system of people working the land, but it didn't work. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I have pointed.
But it is, yeah. And it actually, you touched on it. Like, for example, the punishment, right? Like Haiti was not able to have the diplomatic and trade relations with other nations.
Yeah.
The thing that you bring up, which was all these reparations that they had to pay to France, that a lot of it left the country deeply indebted. And so I think that's something that I always want people to know, because I think that a lot of times people think, well, like, oh, you know, Haiti is like this because they took their independence and they, you know, like almost like they did this to themselves. And I think it's important for people to understand that they had to pay this like major colonial power, this tiny island, they had to pay them back. You know what I mean? Which is unconscionable.
Right.
I think people don't understand. It's kind of like this whole system of, like, for example, in the United States, right? Like you have, let's say, Black entrepreneurs that are having access to capital, right? There's a whole historical precedent for that, right? A lot of times people look at Black businesses and say like, oh, well, they just didn't manage their money properly. It's like, no, you need to understand all of the historical underpinnings that you know lead to that. So
correct.
I definitely wanted to bring that up and make sure that we talked about those reparations to France, which, I mean, they even had to like pay them back for the roads that France put there. So it's the holiday season and Haitian Independence Day is coming up on January 1st. What does a Haitian Independence Day celebration look like in your home? What did it look like when you were growing up? You know, Caribbean people, we like to do a celebration.
We do. We'd love to do a celebration. So for me, growing up, it always included soup, which is a Haitian independence soup. And I'll go into more detail about that afterwards, but that we also had time with family. So time with my grandmother. My grandmother made an amazing soup jumeau. She was born in 1917 and died in 2017. So she lived to 100. But she came to the United States in the mid 60s, or actually, early 60s, actually. And she lived here. She actually never went back to Haiti. So although my father's family had always stayed there, my grandmother, when she migrated, she never returned. And my parents actually moved back themselves about 15 years ago. So my parents live there now, but at the time it would involve visits to my grandmother. My grandmother was notorious for being an amazing cook. And so people would come through the home regularly. We also, in our house, we often had soup jumeau on Sundays. Maybe it was like a couple times a month on a Sunday. But on January 1st, it would be, you have to go and drink grandma's soup. Like, you don't just, stay home. And so in my house, I have continued that. I have 4 children, and my children know that, January 1st is Soup Jumeau Day. We often have gatherings where I'll have other people over, my siblings. Last year, we did a very small one. Why was it so small? I think last year we only had like 10 people, or earlier this year. And of course, now 2021, we probably won't have anyone because of COVID. Right. But I just take great pleasure in like getting up early to make it, and my kids, know, and I'm teaching them to make it. And I always feel like it's kind of almost like a spiritual exercise, because that all over the world, Haitians are eating the same soup on the same day. It's like, when I was raised Catholic. And so when you go to the Catholic church and it's like, you do all of those things, you can go into a Catholic church anywhere in the world, no matter the language, and know how to do those things. And so that's why I see it almost as like a liturgy, right? Because those things are the liturgy. And so I see Soup Jumeau is very much as a part of the Haitian liturgy, no matter where you are in the world, that on January 1st, you will be making your Soup Jumeau. And there's so much, again, now with the internet, it's great. There's so much. I mean, you go look up hashtag Soup Jumeau on Instagram. There's a song, an ode to Soup Jumeau. There are people now, actually one of my favorite Haitian chefs who I love, I purposely brought this to show you. Her name is Nadège Fleur-Limon. She's amazing if you can ever interview her. And she wrote this book called Haiti Uncovered, a regional adventure into the art of Haitian cuisine. And what I love about this is that it's a coffee table book, right? But it's a cookbook. So it has all of these recipes in here. And so I know that like I learned my recipe from a combination of my mother and my aunt. And so basically the soup, the way that people make it is that you use a base of squash. And you put like really delicious vegetables like potatoes and carrots and celery. Some people put cabbage and some kind of noodle. And you can make it vegetarian. I know people have, but it was first originally always made with beef. I have an aunt that makes it with chicken, which when I first tasted that, it felt, I loved it. So I always make mine with chicken too. But what I love about that cookbook too is that my mother, and I'm sure you have women in your family like this too, my mother and my aunt, whenever I ask them for a recipe, they have no measurements, right? They're like, just,
none.
Got it. Like, just like, just look over it, look after it, put a little bit. And I'm like, this is not helpful. Like, I need to know how many cups.
Yes, exactly.
So the cookbooks are helpful. I really appreciate the labor of Haitian chefs who are doing this work. Well, I didn't tell you the story behind the soup, which I know is important.
Yes. I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you to talk about soup jumeau or French or freedom soup.
Freedom soup, yes. Okay, so the story behind soup jumeau is that Dessalines, so what you should know about Jean-Jacques Dessalines is that he was notorious for his hatred of white people, right? And so he was the guy who, like, to make the Haitian flag was like, rip out the white and sew it back together. He was the guy who told the soldiers, like, I don't want to see anything white left in this country. If you see a white flower, rip it out. If you see a white dog, kill it. Anything white has to go. So after independence and, you know, when everything was official, he said, all of the food that the French did not allow us to eat, I want us to take that and gather it. And so, you know, it was the women at the time who did the cooking. And so make something delicious with that. And so what these women ended up making was soup jumeau. And so one of the things that the Haitians were not allowed to have were a lot of these really delicious vegetables, like what's called giroumeau, right? Which that's where it comes from in French. Again, which is like a variant of like pumpkin or squash, right? And, you know, things like those delicious, like potatoes, you know, like just some of these rich, really wonderful vegetables. And of course, they were not allowed to have meat, right? So, they were not allowed to have the good meat. So that's how soup jumeau came to being. And it was a way to celebrate our freedom.
I love that. And I love that it's like essentially a taste of everything that we weren't allowed to have.
Yes.
We're gonna indulge in this. It's interesting because one of the things that I read about soup jumeau was that, to your point about not being able to have like some of these, like, you know, really good ingredients, was that even though they would cook it, it was illegal for the cook to taste the finished product. I was like, wow. So it just makes it even more indulgent.
Exactly.
To be able to, and just sidebar, one of the things, there's a soup that Jamaicans make that is very, like you make it with, well, you know what? All recipes are different. My mother makes it with chicken, but it is, it's just like, it's called, like, it's a soup, but you have like pumpkin in it. And I don't even know, we just call it pumpkin. And I can't get it at like, I should say a traditional supermarket. Like I have to go to like my special, like Caribbean, African, Asian supermarket. And I sometimes wonder, just because a lot of the vegetation was so similar in the Caribbean, are, you know, like obviously the soup that you're talking about is more, like it looks more pumpkin-y than what I'm talking about. But I'm just wondering if is it the same pumpkin? Like, is it the same pumpkin that everybody's using in the Caribbean?
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, there's so many things like that where like it's called one thing, like it's called pumpkin, but it's not like this pumpkin that you think,
right?
You know, that
it's
people
not like what
put
American
out at Halloween.
Pumpkin, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why, and so that's a part of like the genealogy of soup jumeau that's always a little bit confusing to me, because I would imagine, I'm like, so wait, is it just like when people that people in the diaspora started using like this kind of squash, you know what I mean? But my understanding is that, again, that word giroumeau, from the French word, but it could be the same thing though with pumpkin, because that means that.
When I was reading about it, I was like, how much you want to bet this pumpkin that they're using is the same pumpkin that they were putting in that soup in Jamaica?
Exactly.
So I'm going to read you something It says, I'm Haitian and also a chef. I have a lot of respect for Chef Marcus, but Chef, you're messed up. Soup jumeau is in our blood. It's in our DNA. Disrespect the Haitian national soup. It's like disrespecting the American flag. You are a great chef, and I respect that. There are thousands of Haitian chefs right here in the US that are upset and very mad about your approach to soup jumeau. You should apologize to the Haitian community. You'll never see a Haitian chef write or cook Ethiopian food the way that you disrespected our soup jumeau. You must apologize. Also, Luis Jean, Orlando, Florida, December 3rd, 2020. By the way, he put his first name, his last name. So that was a comment from Bon Appetit's article. Yes. Pumpkin, which they've changed. I'll just get into that a little bit, but now the article is named Pumpkin Soup with Spice Nuts by Marcus.
They fixed it.
So on December 1st, Bon Appetit published the online version of their December 2020, January 2021 holiday issue that was guest edited by Chef Marcus Samuelson. One of the recipes in the issue was a soup recipe that came from Marcus's new cookbook. There's a recipe called Independence soup. Okay. And then when Bon Appetit printed the issue, the soup was published under the title Soup Jumeau.
Oh, interesting.
So they said, according to their Instagram, it says, we've updated the name and the head note of this recipe to accurately reflect that this pumpkin soup from Chef Marcus Samuelson is inspired by the historic Haitian soup jumeau, excerpted from his cookbook, The Rise. We apologize for misrepresenting this recipe. And I know you tweeted a picture of your soup jumeau to Bon Appetit. Tell me, what did you find problematic and what would you have liked to see Bon Appetit handle that?
I was really disappointed in Marcus, I have to say. Marcus is Ethiopian. One of my best friends is Ethiopian. I've been to Ethiopia. I love I actually feel like Haiti and Ethiopia are similar in our minds because of the ways that they resisted, in Ethiopia's case, colonialism, and in Haiti's case, slavery. And I know that he also went to Miami to learn how to make soup jumeau from some Haitian women. And so, I was just really disappointed. Why wouldn't you choose to amplify, Haiti as opposed to do this? So I was disappointed in him, even though I don't know him. I was frustrated that, I think the first thing I'm looking back at my Twitter now, because the first thing that I tweeted was, hey, Bon Appetit, we actually have Haitian chefs. We have Haitian celebrity chefs. We have Haitian chefs that are well-known.
Gregory Gourdet. Do you know who Gregory Gourdet is? Yes.
It's not like they're obscure.
Yeah.
And so, I tweeted a couple of names of them. These are people you should look up if you want to do, maybe you should do a special issue on Haiti, because we have many delicacies other than the soup that are wonderful. And so I just felt like that was kind of, irresponsible of them. And then I found out that this was not the first time that Bon Appetit has done this also. So this seems to be a problem, which kind of makes me think there's probably room in the market for a really great African diasporic culinary magazine. Just saying, if you need more to do on your plate. But then, but then I went and I read all of the comments. And I tell you, I laughed so hard I cried. I read them to my husband. I was like, and I felt very proud and happy, honestly, after that, because I was like, we will not back. We will fight you. We will tell you.
Yes.
One of my friends on Twitter was saying, there's a scholar that always talks about how Haiti has so many great writers. And you saw just the prose that these people were putting out in service of soup jumeau, which just made me so happy.
Yes.
So, in the end, I was like, well, I'm glad this happened, because it gave us a moment to take pride in and, remember, remind everyone exactly who we are.
And so my last question would be, because I think that there are a lot of people who don't know about Haitian food and what's a traditional, what are some things, what are some foods, particularly around the holidays, that would be cooked in a traditional Haitian household?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So like you all, we do have the Julie Collet, right? Which is the you all red rice and peas. I forget how you all call it, but
Rice and peas, yeah.
yeah, rice and peas, right? So that, is that we make with these red pinto beans, and so we have that. What's interesting is that I learned in college, because I have a best friend who's Jamaican, that you all add coconut milk, and I was like, oh no, Haitians don't do that. But it turns out that Haitians from the south of Haiti do that, and that's another thing I love about that book that I was showing you, is that she really goes through some of the regional differences of the food, which is wonderful. So definitely, rice and peas, or julia poakole is what we call it, julia poakole, which literally means rice with peas or beans stuck to it. I just love that. Yeah, kole means stuck to it. We also have Julie Jonjon, which I'm sure you've had. It's the black rice.
Oh yeah, that's the one I've seen and heard of.
So
yes,
and
tasted.
And so that's made with these dried mushrooms. So jonjon is mushroom, and they're actually these dried mushrooms. You boil them, and then the water, you use the black water. So it's the same way that you make julie collé, right? But you're using this black water. And then, traditionally, like, people will put lima beans or peas. And then we have, also, you would make that with a poulet non sauce rouge, right? So like a chicken in a red sauce, which is very similar to just like a regular stew chicken. We have a lot of things that are like based with the red sauce. And then of course, griot, which is the pork, right? Which is the grilled pork that we have. That is just so delicious and so special. And then you would have that with like pickles on it, which is, pickles is like a shredded cabbage and, peppers. It's very spicy. It's almost like, I guess the closest like American word would be a relish, kind of, right? So if you imagine like a hot sauce, right? But that's like that, kind of like kimchi, right? You know kimchi?
Okay, yes.
It's like a Haitian version of kimchi, right? Because it's cabbage and it's very spiced and there's vinegar and you have to can it for a long time. And so you would put that, with your griot and with your banan. And then, soup jumeau always gets all of the attention because it's freedom soup, but we have a very delicious soup called bouillon, which is just like, it's a very light soup, very brothy, and it has like, beef and épinal, spinach, and tomato. Like, okay, so not super brothy. Like it's not as thick as soup jumeau, but it depends on who makes it, though, actually, to be honest, because I know like my grandmother made it more brothy than like my mom did, right? And then it has these like dumplings, what you all would call those dumplings, like, because you guys in your sauce pois, I'm like, you guys, the Jamaicans, in your sauce pois, you put those like floured.
Oh, the spinners, yeah.
Correct. And so sauce pois is another thing that we have over white rice. Sauce pois is like the bean boiled down. It's the pinto beans boiled down so that it's like it's a sauce, a bean sauce, right?
So you all use pinto beans a lot. Yes. We use like the red peas and then gunga peas, which are like I think the American word might be pigeon peas.
Okay, yes. That's right. We use that too.
Okay, yeah.
We use pigeon peas too. But I remember my friend who's Jamaican made me sauce pois with the dumpling in it. And I was like, what? Like,
oh, was there pork too?
Yes.
Stew peas and rice. You're talking about stew peas and rice. Yes. It's so good.
It's delicious. And so it's just funny to me because here we have something. So we call it dumbwe. So that flour, I don't know what to call it other than a dumpling, but it's like flour.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And so we have it in that bouillon soup. I'm like hungry now. I want to make bouillon. I want to make bouillon so bad. It's so good.
So this is my last question. And I think I may know the answer to this. This is my last question that we ask all of our guests. As you know, the podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Oh my gosh. This is sad because I want to eat at my grandmother's house, but she's also gone, right? So I can't. Okay, so there is a woman that I love. She was my children's childcare provider, my girls, Tante Paulette. We call her Tante Paulette. So she watched my girls from the time they were, 6 months till preschool. Tante Paulette is such an amazing cook. She would make me bouillon and bring it to me. I would eat at Tante Paulette's. I would go over to Popo, we also call her. I would go over to Tante Paulette and I would eat there with her a delicious meal with all the Haitian food. And I would want it all. I'd be like, I want the soup, and I'm gonna have rice, and I'm gonna have beans, and I'm gonna have it all. The desserts, because we have this dessert called penultimate, which is like, it's like, how do I describe this? It's kind of like a sweet potato-ish kind of thing. So good.
I love it so much. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. It's going to be a great episode, great way for us to end our season as well.